Hello, friends. My name is Steve, and welcome to Page Chewing. And also, welcome back to the Friday Conversation. Hope everyone had a fantastic week. And this week, I'm here with Marj. Marj, will you give us an introduction, please?
Sure. Thank you, Steve, for having me. So I guess I could start at the beginning. I grew up in a small town in Iowa with the major goal of getting out of there. I guess I also had a goal of going to college, although college was something that was not usual in my family. My parents did not go to college. My grandparents did not go to college. In fact, the only person I knew who had gone to college other than my high school instructors was my brother, who was 3 years older than I am, and he went to college. So that was my goal, was to get out of there, go to college, and come up with a career. So I went to school. I got a bachelor's in journalism in Iowa, and then a master's in journalism in Wisconsin, and went to work for weekly and daily newspapers for 8 years or so, and was recruited from the Billings Gazette, it's Montana, Billings, Montana Gazette, to work for the Wall Street Journal. So I went to work for the Wall Street Journal, which I did for 12 years. It was truly at first brutal experience because I thought I knew how to write and I found out I didn't. But I learned a lot. I enjoyed a lot. I traveled a lot. It was a terrific experience. But after 12 years at the Journal, I felt bored. And, it's a weird word to use because as a journalist, you got to interview different people and write different stories and go to different places. And so in some ways, it should never have been boring, but it was the process of, researching, writing, arguing with editors, then researching, writing, arguing with editors. And it just got too repetitive and I felt like I needed to learn something new. So I left journalism. I got my MBA and went to work in corporate finance. Weird shift. But it certainly was something new. So I worked in corporate finance for another 15 years, working with analysts and investors on Wall Street, interpreting corporate financial reports. And that was quite fun and quite interesting, mainly because it was so different. It was so different. And of course, I traveled a lot. I traveled a lot in South America. I even traveled in Siberia. Lots of great experiences there too. But at some point, I basically aged out of employability, is the way I will put it. It was the end of a particular job and realizing at 60 years old, I wasn't going to get another job, even though I did try for a while, but I realized it was my age that was becoming a problem. So I did what I always wanted to do, which was I started writing novels. And since then, I have written, that was how many years ago? 14 years ago? Since then, I've written 13 novels, some of which were self-published, some of which were traditionally published. I have another 3 novels in my computer that will eventually get out into the world. And at the same time, because I was doing some self-publishing, I learned a lot of the things you need to know to self-publish, the formatting, using INDD, InDesign, using for Photoshop. So I learned how to do design covers, learned how to format interiors, learned how to get access and publish on Amazon and Ingram, the wholesaler, and began doing a lot of that for other people at the same time. And that was quite rewarding. I should note that I do no marketing for other people. I don't really care for marketing, and I don't think I'm very good at it. But I do all the other stuff that goes around self-publishing. So that's kind of my career track. Personally, I'm married, have been married for 35 years, which is now exactly half of my life, which is in some ways a tremendous miracle. For a person who never thought she'd get married at all. But I guess, if if you're going to get married and you never thought you would, you just stick with the first one, Why, why try it again? So, Ben and I have been married for 35 years. We play a little golf. And probably the love of my life is dogs.
Hmm.
I love dogs far more than I like most people. In fact, I have a keychain that says, "Hold my keys, I need to pet this dog," because I never see a dog I don't love. So that's about all there is to say about me, I think.
I'm sure there's more than that, but we can
Yeah,
definitely agree on being a dog lover. I love dogs. So yeah.
yeah, oh, good,
Oh yeah.
good.
I need the keychain too, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. When you transitioned to the journal, and you said it was a big difference. You realized you didn't know really how, or you didn't know writing as well as you thought you did. What were some of the main things that you learned from that transition going?
Oh, yeah, yeah. First of all, you learn, I think, although I had always thought that I was a fairly good writer, I really learned that every damn sentence has to be perfect.
Hmm.
There's no sloppiness allowed, especially at that level. I also learned a lot about framing a story. Now, the journal, in terms of the feature stories, I'm not speaking so much of our daily news coverage, but the feature stories, the three stories that used to appear on the front page, which has changed, of course, significantly since I was there. The three stories, that there was a structure to those. And you had to learn that structure. And in some ways, it's interesting because I think it has been helpful in helping me structure fiction.
Hmm.
The sort of idea of setting up a situation. There's some sort of a conundrum or a paradox or a challenge, and then figuring out what the answer to that challenge or the solution to that challenge is. And in some ways, I think that was very helpful in helping me later write fiction.
Hmm.
But when I went to the journal, I didn't know any of that.
Hmm.
And I thought transitions were something you just sort of conjured up. You went from this paragraph to that paragraph by creating some sort of fancy transition. And it turned out that wasn't the way to do it.
Hmm.
There was a much more sophisticated way to structure, to outline your story. So it took some time, but I learned it well enough to stay for 12 years.
Yeah, that's a big. Is it a similar leap when you started writing novels and started writing fiction and learned self-publishing and the whole publishing game, I guess you can say?
I would say that the similarity may have been in learning to take yourself seriously.
Hmm.
Um, when you first start writing fiction, you think, "Oh, it's fiction," you just write and you have fun, and that's it. But learning to take it as seriously as you take nonfiction, that was a learning experience for me. Um, and the other thing that I learned going from journalism, which is a very deadline sort of business, to writing fiction, was learning to slow down,
Hmm.
learning to not be in a hurry to get something published, not to be in a hurry to get something out, but to realize that these things need a little incubation, they need a little fermentation, they need a little time. And so you needed to back off. And I have learned over time that the longer you stay away from a first draft or a second draft or a third draft, the better your book is going to end up being. So I would say the biggest thing that I learned in that transition was patience.
Hmm. That must have been a very hard habit to break, having deadlines and being under, I would imagine, constant pressure to deliver on a certain deadline. To go from that to taking your time, that must have been very strange and difficult.
Yeah, and I would say this about that. I think that what journalism and deadlines did for me was take away the fear of the blank screen.
Hmm.
I can sit down and write when it's time to sit down and write, and I don't have writer's block, because when you're a journalist, you don't have time for writer's block.
Yeah.
You learn to sit down and start writing and get it done, right? So that helped a lot in making that transition from journalism to writing fiction. The thing that you need patience with is after you've written that first draft. You need patience. You thinking, oh, I've written this story. I want to get it out. I want people to read it. And that's a really bad idea. You really need to back off, let it sit for a while, go back, because, you can't see anything if you try to edit your book or rewrite your book right away. You really have to give it time. And that's where the patience really came in. I still write fast, and I still have no fear of the blank page. Um, but I have learned to back off that first draft. It's really no good, and learning to accept the fact that it's no good is part of the learning process.
It's a lot of people are a lot of people that I've spoken with and friends that I have are all afraid of that blank page of the cursor and the writer's block. And I wonder if it's something that they just, I don't want to say talk themselves into, but they maybe overthink or maybe get lost, put pressure on themselves to produce something instead of just having patience and letting it come as it comes.
I think you're right. I think people do sort of buy into the myth of writer's block, and I don't think they have to. They don't have to. They don't have to do that. What they should do, I think, is realize that that sentence that they're going to put down is going to suck, and they're going to have to rewrite it. And as soon as they can accept that, it's a lot easier to write that first sentence. And once you write the first sentence, the second sentence is easier, and the third sentence, and so on. So I do think that I taught a lot of fiction writing and memoir writing
Hmm.
classes, and at libraries and bookstores. And the thing I always tell people is, don't be afraid of that first sentence. Put it down. It may never see the light of day. It may disappear, 20 drafts later, but get it down and get
Hmm.
going. And I think journalism really did help me learn to do that and be able to do that.
You're right about the first sentence. Once you get the first, even just the first few words, then it just seems less daunting. The page has something on it, so it's not as intimidating.
Yeah, yeah, that's really true. It's really true. And I think the other thing that you have to learn is how you work. That is, do you every time you write a paragraph, do you go back and read it over and try to fix it and edit it and make it perfect? Or do you write that first paragraph and then go on and write the second one and go on and write it, a chapter or however many pages you intend to write for that day, and don't worry about going back. And I think that's a very individual thing. I know some writers who say they never go back and edit till the whole thing's done.
Hmm.
Some people say they never go back and edit till the next day. And some people just edit as they go. And I think it's a very individual thing. I don't think there's any right way or wrong way to do it. But I think you're right. Once you get that first sentence down and get going, half the battle's over.
Hmm. And you mentioned you've taught classes too. It seems like uh, someone would even now if a new or aspiring author would come to you and say what advice, asking for advice or for something to kind of get them, what advice would you give them to encourage them?
My number one advice is to read, read, read. I'm going to turn off my, there we go. Read, read, read. I think there is nothing that helps you learn to write or to write better than reading.
Hmm.
I read probably 12 books a month.
Wow.
I can't stop reading, and I learn from every book. Whether I learn how to write badly, I learn this
Yeah.
is not how I want to write, or I learn, wow, I had never thought about constructing a story this way.
Hmm.
I read constantly, and I think, I have read, many people send me manuscripts they want me to look at. And I can tell the difference between a person who reads a lot of fiction and a person who doesn't read a lot of fiction but somehow wants to write it.
Hmm.
And there's a world's difference. People who read fiction and kind of understand how it works are much better writers. I think reading is essential. So number one, read.
Hmm. What are some tells for you when you pick up a manuscript, or reading work that's kind of in progress? What are some things that you notice from people who read a lot versus people who don't? Are there certain signs that you notice pretty quickly?
Yeah, I would say the difference between people who read a lot and therefore write better than people who don't read and don't write so well. I suppose it's possible there's someone out there who's never reads anything and writes perfectly. But what I notice is they don't really understand how they are taking the reader's hand and leading them through a story.
Hmm.
They don't really understand what the reader needs to know to move from one sentence to the next and from one scene to the next. And in fact, they don't even seem to understand what it takes for a reader to understand a scene.
Hmm.
And I don't know, that may sound terribly pedantic, but it's like they don't have the empathy for the reader
Hmm.
that they should have, that helps them understand what the reader needs to move through the story. And they may throw lots of sentences and lots of dialogue and lots of setting and things together, but they don't help the reader move from the first sentence to the second sentence and so on through the story. I mean, there are certainly there's many books, well-written books, wonderful books, where you may start as a reader thinking, I don't know what's getting, I can't understand what's going on here. I don't get it. I don't get it. But in spite of that initial feeling, because the writer's empathetic enough with the reader, they eventually catch up.
Hmm.
And when you read you read a manuscript from someone who doesn't read, they don't do that. They never help you catch up.
Hmm.
And they simply are going on and telling things they want to tell and writing things they want to write, but they're not empathetic enough to help the reader get through it.
Hmm. Interesting. Has there been, you mentioned you read 12 books a month, which you need to show me how you teach me your tricks, but has there been a book recently that stands out to you that you feel like you've learned something from it, or you found something that surprised you, like, well, that's a neat trick, or that's something that kind of something new that you hadn't read before, I guess you can say.
Well, I wish I'd thought of this beforehand. Thinking of all the books that I've read recently, I would say I just finished reading Go as a River. And I don't know if you've read that, but you've certainly heard about it. It's done amazingly well. The publishers, Spiegel and Grau, are very aggressive marketers and publicity people, and they know what they're doing. And Shelley Reed wrote a beautiful book.
Hmm.
I guess what I would say about what I learned from that book was that the protagonist's solutions to the problems in her life can can come very slowly and can develop over a long period of time. I think often, again, this is a matter of patience, learning to let your protagonist stumble
Hmm.
for quite a while before they come into their own. And I think she does a terrific job of letting her protagonist learn. Victoria is the protagonist's name. Learn. Of course, she's a very young girl at the start of the book, which means that she has a lot to learn. But she does a great job of pacing that book and letting things develop over time.
Hmm. I would imagine that's hard to do sometimes, because you have to get from those each point to point to point. So is it just a matter of wanting to get from point A to point B and not wanting to explain how they got there? Is that part of it?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. I think, we when we start writing a novel, when I start, I'm a plotter. I'm not a pantser. And I'm sure you've talked to other authors about the difference between plotting and pantsing, but I do a lot of plotting. And part of the plotting process is learning how to pace. Um, and learning how not to come up with a solution in the second chapter, right? So I think that you're right on when you say that. I think it is a matter of patience again. You want your reader to grow up with your protagonist, and and I know it's not a given, and some people will disagree with me about what happens in novels and what happens in stories. But I think the stories that I write, I always want to see growth, whether a person's 60 years old and growing from there, or 16 years old and growing from there. I want to see real growth. And what Shelley Reed does so well in Go as a River is pacing that growth of her protagonist. It doesn't happen all at once, and it's painful and it's difficult, but she does grow over time. And I think that's really, I used to say that there's two things that have to happen in a novel. One is growth of the protagonist. They have to grow. And another thing is there has to be a lesson. They have to learn something that helps them grow. And, certainly what happens in Go as a River is she learns to believe in herself. She learns to realize that she's been a servant, and she doesn't have to be a servant. She can be her own person, and she can take care of herself, and she can make her own life. And in my novels, women learn, basically, most of them, I would say, in my novels, women learn to be more independent
Hmm.
and stronger and believe in themselves to a greater extent than they had before.
Hmm. And I want to get to that more in just a second. I was wondering about when you transitioned over to writing fiction and got into into publishing. Were you familiar at all with how publishing worked at the time, or did you just go in feet first?
Oh no, I was an idiot, truly, and maybe I still am. But no, and since I started 13, 14 years ago, 14 years ago, writing novels, the industry's changed
Mhm.
significantly. I mean, it is so much harder to become a published, especially a traditionally published novelist today than it has ever been. It is brutally awful. If you are not a celebrity, you don't have relatives in the publishing industry, or, be best if you had parents in the publishing industry. If you didn't get an MFA at Iowa or Dartmouth or Stanford, um, it's very, very, very hard to get a publishing contract or get an agent to start with
Mhm.
and to get a publishing contract. I have a very good friend whom I think a tremendous amount of. She's really a wonderful writer who started writing novels 20 years ago as a 55-year-old. And she has been very successful. She has 30 some novels published by St. Martin's Press. She's been very successful. Um, is she that much better writer than people who can't find agents today? Probably not.
Mhm.
The difference is she started 20 years
Yeah.
ago. She has an audience. She has a dedicated agent. She has a dedicated publisher. That is so much harder today than it was back then. There was a very interesting article that just came out in uh, the Enquirer, no, the Economist, I believe it was. It was one of the British publications about how different it is
Hmm.
to publish today than it used to be. It's um, it's tremendously different. But even saying that, when I went into writing novels and trying to get published 14 years ago, I knew nothing. I thought, well, you send out 10 query letters and you tell people what your story's about, and six of them will respond, and three of them will come up with publishing offers, and yeah, and you go off from there. Well, that's just It wasn't true then, and it certainly isn't true now. It is really, really hard. And I learned over time, when I first started and I sent out, my 100 query letters and nothing came
Hmm.
back, I decided, the heck with it, I'm going to self-publish. So I went ahead and self published. And what I learned in that process was that patience thing that I've talked
Hmm.
about. That that second or third draft that you've written that you think is perfect isn't. Don't publish it. Wait. Have 20 people read it. Hire a good editor. All of those things. Don't rush to publish. So I learned that, but I guess the hardest thing to learn was that I was 60 years old, and it was probably too late to become Gail Godwin
Hmm.
or Margaret Atwood or whatever writer you really love. It was too late, and I learned that, and it's fine, and I'm happy with this, with the level of success that I've come to. But it's been a lot harder than I thought it would be.
Wow. Yeah, I was really surprised even now as I learn more about the publishing industry. It seems like a very, very difficult um, trail, or very difficult to process to succeed in. There's just is do you think the change over the last 10 to 15 years is the amount of people wanting to publish? Is it the quality? Is it just the industry that's changing? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are that of course everything costs more, so
Hmm.
book publishing is more expensive. Um, People don't read as much as they used to. Um, I'm not that educated in the economics of the difference between the profitability of ebooks versus the profitability of printed books. It seems to me that as people read more and more ebooks, it should be less expensive to publish, not more, because you don't have to deal with the printing and the distribution. Um, but at the same time, it seems that the economics, we all know the economics of the business have deteriorated.
Hmm.
And as they deteriorate, publishers are looking for the easy hits. And the easy hits are celebrities, Stephen King, um, you know, uh, Nora Roberts, the easy people to go to. And I think that has changed. I think also the industry has always been, publishers have always been looking for someone they can work with over time
Hmm.
and sell over time. So if you're a 30-year-old who just came out of an MFA program, a publisher is much more likely to take a chance on you because they feel like they have a future with you. When you're 60 years old, not so much. I
Hmm.
went to the convention in San Antonio of the Historical Novel Society last June, and there was a panel of agents, and three agents, very successful agents, and they all said they would not take on an older writer because if they did and turned those novels over, tried to sell them to a publisher, the publisher would look us up, find out how old we are, and reject us.
Wow.
So, of course, the entire audience that goes to these conventions are 60-year-olds, right? Or 70-year-olds or whatever. So you could hear the groan
Hmm.
in the audience as they said this. And I think it's true. And it may be more true today than it used to be. I don't know for sure about that. But I do know that if you want to make a future, you want to make a career as a fiction writer, start when you're 30,
Hmm.
not when you're 60.
Wow. I'm friends with. I know Jenny Wirtz, the fantasy author, and she's mentioned several times during our conversations that if she could go back, she would use a pen name that is, that would be not kind of like Robin Hobb. Like Robin Hobb, Robin Hobb is her pen name. So you're not sure if it's male or female or who it is. Is that something that you've thought about looking back on using a pen name, or I guess part of it is that now with social media, you almost have to be out there and have to sell yourself along with your work, which seems really odd to me, but that's, I guess, just the nature of the beast. But have you ever considered that about just being more private or having a name or being like a faceless author that they don't know anything about you personally?
It's kind of an interesting thing because I know for a long time people said, well, you should use your initials so they don't know whether you're a man or a woman because they're more likely to publish a man. And I don't really think that's true. If you look at the books, if you get away from Stephen King and Harlan Coben and some of the very popular uh, thriller and murder and mystery novelists, and you look at what's getting published, it's mostly women.
Hmm.
I mean, it's mostly women. And when I have a local many local writers groups, including a historical novel society chapter, a Colorado Authors League chapter, the Colorado Independent Book Publishers Association, many. And when I go to those meetings, it's largely women.
Hmm.
And that doesn't mean it's largely women getting published, but I don't think that being a woman is any more as much of a barrier as it used to be. Because look at Hillary, look at Hillary Mantel, look at Maggie O'Farrell, look at Lauren Groff. I mean, these people have been extremely successful, and no one thinks they should have published under some sort of a pen name that hid their gender. I don't think that's as important as it used to
Hmm.
be.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's something that we talked a little bit before we started recording about marketing, and it almost seems when you self-publish, it almost seems like writing the book is just for the first half of the journey. It seems like the marketing and the getting it out there and the promoting and the time spent on social media and the time spent on things like this, that it seems like it's almost you're only halfway there with
If
possibly.
that
Yeah.
far. If that far. I think, writing the book and getting it ready for publication, making sure it's well edited and it's well formatted and the cover design is exactly what it should be. All of that is, I would say,
Wow.
a third of the effort. You can have a great book and people can think it's really well written and and you can win awards, and yet you still can't sell the damn thing. It really is frustrating that discovery is still the biggest challenge, trying to get people to find out about your book and to learn about your book. And when you can't afford a $15,000 publicist or a $40,000 publicist, that's way above my pay grade. To do this work for you, you have to do it. And even if you do it, even if you spend 20 hours a week doing this marketing, social media, and podcasts, which are wonderful, which are the best, probably the best thing. It is most fun. But writing Instagram posts and Facebook posts and trying to find ways to engage readers that isn't all about buy my book.
Mhm.
Because people don't want to read 20 times a week that you want them to buy your book. You want to find other ways to engage them. Is very frustrating. And the other thing is, a lot of local groups think that the solution is to sponsor book fairs
Hmm.
and invite writers to come and have a table and sell books at a book fair. And my experience has been nobody shows up.
Hmm.
They can market, they put them on, I've done Facebook boosts and such to help people market their book fairs, but people don't go to book fairs like they maybe once did. So that has not worked out, but it's a lot of time and it's a lot of effort, and you have to buy the books to get, to schlep them to the book fair, and you have to do posters and all of
Hmm.
that other stuff. And it really does not pay off. So scratch that one off. Social media, you have to find ways to engage readers that's other than buy my book. And And I think also, it helps a lot if you are in many ways an attractive
Hmm.
person. And by that, I mean not just a very good looking person, but that you have some sort of background or story that people kind of glom onto. And I think that helps a lot. So, once again, it helps a lot to be a celebrity.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't know. I think the marketing takes probably 2/3 of your time
Wow.
when you'd much rather be writing books. And I have a number of writing friends who are good writers who simply have given up on it. And they write their books and they put them out there. And if no one buys them and no one reads them, they don't care because they're doing what they really love to do. And I have to say, if you don't go into this business as a young person with the thinking it was going to be a career, like I did not, I think it's okay. You're doing it because it's what you love, what you've always wanted to do. I mean, I decided I wanted to be a writer in second grade,
Hmm.
and it's always been something I wanted to do. But it wasn't until I was 60 and retired that I was able to spend the time doing it. And once I decided that's what I was going to do, making money at it was never really the goal.
Yeah. I feel for the authors who are depending on it for income, who are trying to get their work out, and along with the other thousands of people just screaming into the void on social media, that it must be really tough to just a tough road to travel.
Well, to try to break through the
Hmm.
clutter, try to break through the marketing clutter out there. It's yeah, it must be very frustrating. Let me say this, if you're trying to make a living as a novelist and you're not a celebrity and you didn't grow up in the publishing industry with parents or, aunts and uncles or whatever, you're maybe kind of foolish because it's really, really going to be hard.
Yeah,
It's really going to be hard.
yeah, very tough. It's hard to transition from that, but I did want to ask you about medieval fantasy because it's one of the questions that you had listed. I wanted to ask about what do you think is contributes to the rise in popularity of medieval fiction?
Well, there's a difference between medieval fiction and medieval
Oh,
fantasy. And
okay.
I would say medieval fantasy has kind of ridden on the bandwagon of fantasy. So you see a lot of medieval, or I would say historical fantasy, that is very popular because young people are reading fantasy. And whatever the reasons, whatever socioeconomic reasons there may be, philosophical reasons the young people are turning to fantasy, I don't really understand and I don't write it. But I think that is historical fantasy is very popular because fantasy is very
Hmm.
popular. And as long as you're creating a world creating, which is what fantasy does, you might as well set it in, 1000 AD as opposed to today because you're making up a world anyway. And I think that is very popular because fantasy is popular. Historical fiction, I actually had an agent who told me after the Rebel Nun, she represented the Rebel Nun, and it did very well, and it won a lot of awards. And I asked her to represent my next novel, and she said, "No, historical fiction's too hard."
Really?
She said, "I'm not going to do it anymore. It's just too hard to sell."
Hmm.
So, and I think it's true. If you think about the number of fantasy books, murder mysteries, romance, out there compared with the amount of historical fiction that actually reaches any sort of popular height. Historical fiction is not that popular,
Hmm.
with the exception of World War II. There seemed to be something that happened about the time that the Alice Network was published, that suddenly women were fascinated, and I think it's largely women readers, were fascinated with the idea of World War II women spies.
Hmm.
And that particular niche of historical fiction took off like crazy. And still today, I read every day what's being sold by agents to publishers. That's still a very big category. And it took off like crazy. But when it comes to medieval fiction, oh, please.
Hmm.
We don't even, we're not on the radar. I subscribe to the Historical Novel Review, which is put out by the Historical Novel Society every quarter. And in that review, they actually review many, many books, and they categorize them by time period. And usually there's a couple sort of Roman Empire, titles, and right up to, maybe 300 AD. And then they skip,
Hmm.
and you don't even see anything until the 11th century.
Hmm.
They just don't exist. And part of it is because people think it's boring, that people think, oh, it's a dark ages, nothing happened. I think also writers have never written much in that period. And the reason is it's harder than heck to do that research. You can't do it on the internet. That is not internet research. And also a lot of the first sources, primary sources, are written in languages, Latin or Greek, or some vulgar Latin, or languages that have disappeared, early English, early German. And so there is not a lot of easy research. It's very difficult research. So no one has written much. And in fact, if you look at what's been popular, Hamnet, The Marriage Portrait, both by Maggie O'Farrell, Laura Groff's book, The Matrix. I think it was just Matrix, not The Matrix. A lot of the books that have done well, that would be considered historical fiction from farther back, they still don't start till the 11th till 12th century.
Hmm.
Nobody writes in this earlier part of time, because you have the research is just brutal. I mean, I should show you my library of medieval, of of barbarian invasions and early Christianity and the fall of Rome, and that's the only place you really find the research. You're able to do the research, and
Hmm.
frankly, I don't think a lot of people have the patience for that. You have to read a 600-page book to get, 3 ideas
Hmm.
or 3 facts, and it's very difficult to write. Because it's difficult to write, people haven't written it, and because people haven't written it, nobody knows that it might be interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to kind of supply the market for the market to be there.
Hmm.
Who would be eating quinoa if we didn't know that, if somebody hadn't decided that quinoa would be a good thing to eat? Somebody has to bring something to the market for the market to say, oh, that's interesting, I think I'll try that.
Hmm.
And it just hasn't happened with certainly early medieval. Even Ken Follett doesn't write that early. His stuff is much, much later.
Hmm. What do you have a specific time period? Because you mentioned the different time periods. Is there a specific period of time that is fascinates you more than others, or that interests you more than other time periods?
Yeah, and part of that's just a matter of efficiency. I mean, I have read so much about basically 400 to 600 or so, even 700 AD. I read so much about it, studied it so much that is particularly interesting to me. And I think it's interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One is nobody thinks it's interesting, and I've seen that there's a lot of things that people don't know about that time, that I didn't know about that time period, that are fascinating. And we can talk about some of
Hmm.
those in a minute. But I think that once you've done that research, you kind of stick to that period. The other thing is that there were some fascinating women in that period that you would think, oh no, that can't be. There were no women doing anything important at that time, because certainly the misogyny and the patriarchy of the Catholic Church kept women, as far down, in the totem pole as they could possibly get. But I mean, if you look at Fredegonde and Hildegard and Brunhild, two queens of the Merovingian kingdom. The most powerful people at that time were two women who hated each other. They were sisters-in-law, and they hated each other, and they tried to kill each other over and over again. And they had a lot of power, and they became regents for their sons and regents for their grandsons. Just tremendously fascinating women. And there's other women like that. I mean, I wrote a novel, The Rebel Nun, about a nun who led a rebellion against the church in 589 AD. Fascinating story, fascinating woman. So if we think about women as being under the thumb of the patriarchy, yes, women were, but there were some outstanding women who really did fight for their independence and fight for their power. And these women have fascinated me. And that's part of why I'm sticking with that time period. So my time period is basically 400 to 700 AD.
When you go back and you research those past events and you read those 600-page books to learn more about the time period, how do you? I would imagine you draw a lot from your time in journalism to know what's important and what to know what to look for when you do find those two or three items in the 600-page book.
I think what I look for is something that's going to surprise me. Look for something that I'm shocked by. For example, this rebellion by nuns in 589. Who would have expected to find that? Nobody would have expected to find that. And in trying to research that, it took me 3 years to try to find enough material about that and about the time. And you build it out because there's only so much written about that particular incident. So you have to build the world around it. And when I was working on The Candlemaker's Woman, which is set in the time of the 406 barbarian invasions, I learned what surprised me were two things. One was the prevalence of slavery at the time, and the other was who the barbarians were, who came across that river. I think in terms of the first instance, the prevalence of slavery, we all kind of knew that there was a lot of slavery in the Roman times. That Rome was basically held together by slaves. But then we had I certainly had this sort of feeling that so you go from Rome and then you're suddenly in the feudal age. Feudalism, and people are serfs, they're not slaves. Well, there was a tremendous time, basically 600 years, when slavery was still prevalent, where 1/3 of people who lived in Europe were slaves. And we don't really realize that because our concept of slavery is very much a recent one. Of 1619 in the U.S. and forward, where we don't realize how prevalent slavery. So when I read that and when I realized that, I thought, well, there's a story. And then the other story that came through from my research was the idea of who the barbarians were. We think of the barbarians as warriors coming across and wanting to conquer Rome and wanting to take over, the empire, when in fact they didn't want to do that. They were forced to do that by the way Rome would not accept them and would not, allow them into the. And most of the people who came across the Rhine River in 406 AD were old men, women, children, all fleeing the Huns and other tribes from the steppes, who were fleeing and trying to find a new home, a new place to settle, to get away from the dangers that they were facing in old Germania. They didn't come because they wanted to rule the Roman Empire, and they didn't come because they wanted to fight or kill people. They came because they had to. They really had no choice. And I think that if you think about that in the context of today's world, I think it's particularly fascinating to realize that this kind of diaspora, this kind of mass migration has been taking place over time since we first walked out of Africa. and it continues, and there's always the same impetus. It's not Hitler trying to conquer France, and become, the king of all of Europe. It is this mass migration is made up of people who are trying to find a new life, trying to find a way to survive and to rebuild their lives. And they're not interested in conquering.
Hmm.
Those two things really struck me as I was researching The Candlemaker's Woman. And I think that's the excitement. You think, is reading 600-page textbooks about medieval history exciting? No, not generally. But when you come across things like that and you go, oh, I didn't know that. Oh my gosh, that's really, and it provides an entirely new perspective on that time and on our stories.
It what does it feel like when you read a story and you find parallels to what's happening today? That must be also a little just to find those parallels of what happened in the past and it's happening again now. It's interesting, but it's also a little bit sad, right? It's just that we're still.
Well, sad. Yeah, sad that we haven't learned. Yeah, that you wonder how long does it take for a species to actually to learn how to exist in the world and do it right. But I'd have to tell you, it's almost as good as sex. I hate to say that, but you come across these things and you go, oh my God, there is really a great story there. And there's enough parallels to what's going on in our current world that you could really get excited about it. And so while it's sad, I think more than being sad, it's really exciting to come across things like that. And you realize you're onto something,
Mhm.
and you're onto something that nobody else is onto right now, especially when you're looking at the time period that I'm looking at. Nobody's onto it because nobody cares. Nobody reads it. So I think it's more exciting than anything when you come across things like that and you start thinking through, okay, so I'm interested in the barbarian invasions, and I've suddenly discovered or learned that the barbarian invasions were different from the way we learned about them in high school. And then you start thinking, how am I going to tell this story? How am I going to make that a personal story about a person who lives in that time? And if you think about the time of the barbarian invasions and how long it really took for Europe to make this huge transition from the Roman Empire to the nation states that we know today, and you think about how do I reflect that very long period of time in a novel that people are going to read, you have to do a lot of strategizing. You have to figure out, how am I going to tell this story? Who is going to be my protagonist? Who's going to tell this story for me? And how can I do it without sounding like I'm writing a history textbook?
Yeah. How do you write that without sounding like a textbook?
Yeah, well, it's really true. And yeah, you find a person that has a situation or personality that is going to be particularly interesting in that context. Just like when you were talking about writing short stories, to write a short story, you create a character, you come up with a character, and you put them in a situation that is really going to test that person. And it's the same way when you're doing a novel. You come up with a person and a personality, a real person in many cases, and in some cases not. And you put that person in this situation, and then you see how they respond and what happens to them.
When you find an interesting story or history that you come across and you have that moment, how do you is it hard to not pull exactly what you're reading off of the history out of history, and I would imagine you have to change it a little bit, or like you said, kind of form people around it and make it, humanize it, make it the characters in that world. But is that something that you're aware of that you try to avoid, is just kind of taking everything and pulling it over? Do you change things, or how do you kind of translate it to fiction?
Well, it's really not tempting to take stuff and move it over because history actually moves very slowly, and people who are um, in the midst of a major historical change don't know that they
Hmm.
are, right? There's no one in the Candlemaker's Woman who is thinking, oh, well, this is a transition from the Roman Empire to nation states of the future. No one thinks that, right? So you're not really tempted to use what you read in a textbook in fiction. But I would say this: historical fiction is part history and it's part fiction. Nobody was running around with a notebook or a tape recorder in 579 AD to hear what people were saying to each other. That has to be fiction. You have to put your character in that situation and imagine how they would talk and imagine how they would interact and imagine how they would feel about the transition that's happening around them, which is much more a daily transition, not not a 5 century transition. It's a daily thing, and so I think the what I would think is more of a challenge is to be true to history and to be true to those things you cannot make up
Hmm.
and use those things to create a structure of sort, but then everything else you really have to make up. You
Hmm.
really have to create. Um, it's funny because it's hard. It's really particularly hard with this early medieval stuff. Nobody really knows what 6th century Paris looked like.
Hmm.
Nobody really knows. There's some archaeological evidence, and there's a little bit of bishops wrote about this and bishops wrote about that. But so much of it is unknown. So you really have to reconstruct it by thinking what was the transportation like? What were the roads like? What buildings do we know were existing at that time and still exist today? There's a lot of you use what you can from history, but when you're writing historical fiction from a period that I'm writing in, a tremendous amount of it has to be reconstructed and has to be imagined, not so much borrowed from textbooks.
Is does that make it a little bit does that make your job a little bit easier to recreate those scenes and the environments to not have so much detail?
Yeah, I think, and Lauren Groff said this once in an interview when she was talking about Matrix, and I think it's very true. The great thing about writing about a period that nobody knows anything about is you get to make a lot of it up. I mean, you really do have a lot of freedom that people who write about World War II women spies don't have nearly the freedom I do. They really there's just too much known
Mhm.
and too many facts that people can challenge them on.
Hmm.
Nobody's challenging me on whether Clotilde, the rebel nun, said this to the bishop or not, because no one knows, right? And what the bishops wrote were was basically biased and always had an agenda. So you don't believe that stuff anyway. So it's a tremendous freedom when you're writing about the periods that I'm writing about. It's harder for a lot of reasons, but there's a freedom, and that's really kind of fun. That's a lot of fun, actually.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. And you mentioned the difference between historical fiction or medieval fiction, medieval fantasy. I was looking recently at the kind of the top sellers, the top fantasy sellers on Amazon, and a lot of them are romance and fantasy. A lot, like I think almost the first page of the top sellers were what's dubbed now as romantasy. Is the Yeah.
Romanticy, yes, the new word romanticy. Yeah, I think that's true. I feel sometimes guilty because I read a lot. I read, but I don't read romance and I don't read fantasy. So I know I'm missing a lot of what's happening in the market because I do not read that stuff. But it doesn't help me with what I'm doing.
Mhm.
So I don't really feel like I have time to delve into that stuff. But you're right. I mean, Iron. What is it? Iron Wing.
Mhm.
Um, the fantasy novel that has been on the top, New York Times bestseller list for weeks. Total fantasy,
Hmm.
set in a world nobody really knows what the time period of this world is, because it's just a made up world. That stuff is so popular. Romance, by the way, is of course the biggest selling genre in the world, and part of the reason for that is dedicated romance readers can read 2 novels a day, and they buy them and they read them and they buy them tomorrow and they read them, and I wonder how do they find the time, but
Yeah.
they do.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear a lot of people complain about or kind of use romance as a punchline, but it's like someone's reading this stuff because I mean, someone's buying it and reading it. So,
Absolutely,
yeah.
yes. People are reading it. Women, and particularly women. Women are reading that romance, and they're reading it every day, and they like a particular story. And if you're a romance writer and you want to reach that audience, you have to follow the rules.
Hmm.
You can't break the rules. You have to follow the rules because that's what people they want the same story. Just give me a different person, describe a different city. They must kiss somehow differently. I don't know, but they basically the plot has to be the same.
Hmm.
I mean, have you ever watched the Hallmark Channel?
Unfortunately, yes.
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 Well, during COVID, I started watching the Hallmark Channel out of boredom. And I thought, well, this is funny. You can time exactly what's going to happen in every 1 hour, or yeah, it's 2 hours, 2 hour Hallmark movies. You can time exactly when the kiss is going to happen, when the kiss break, and then the subsequent breakup is going to happen, and then when they're going to get back together. I mean, it's absolutely rote. It is so. When I was watching that, I thought, well, this is easy. So I wrote 3 Hallmark screenplays for the fun of it,
Hmm.
right? Never intending to do anything with them. And I got done writing them and said, well, that was fun. And then I turned them into novellas and I threw them together in a romance novella. So I have written romance and I did do it according to the rules. The only difference is my people tend to be a little more adventurous and interesting. I mean, they don't go home to the hometown and find the boyfriend they left 20 years ago. It's a little different from that, but it's still the same plot. It's still the same beats.
Hmm. I met a horror author years ago that he told me that he didn't make any money writing horror, but he would write romance under a pen name, and he used the same formula every single time. Changed the character names, changed a few things here and there, but basically the same cookie cutter mold. And he said that's how he funded his writing career. He just he'd pump
Oh,
out romance.
right.
Yeah,
Oh, absolutely. You think about the women writing those books, they're writing the same thing over and over again. And, God bless them, they're making money.
yeah, oh yeah. That's no, it's just interesting that there's, I guess there's a certain amount of comfort to it, just to know that things are going to work out and things are going to be okay, and these things are going to happen. It's kind of like going to the same fast food place every single day, like you know what you're going to get. I,
Yeah, going to the same Starbucks and ordering the same coffee,
yeah,
and you always get the same thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
I guess. I mean, that's, but yeah. I mean, to each their
I
own.
was reading an interesting article in the New Republic yesterday that where a guy was arguing that what we learn from novels is really wrong. That the world doesn't work that way. A novel basically you have an opening situation, you have a conundrum, you have a challenge. The challenge gets greater, and then in the end everything's resolved. That's how novels work. And he said life isn't like that.
Hmm.
The big problem in your life is you hate your job. Does it ever get better? No, probably not, right? And or you have a 17-year-old son who's just a disaster, and he is bent, intends to ruin his life. Do you fix that? Probably not. And yet in novels we fix everything, and that's true for my novels too.
Hmm.
I fix everything. Yeah.
I wonder if the rise in popularity of something like romantasy is if there's a correlation there between just people wanting to escape with the news cycle and social media and just everyday stress and just want an escape from everything.
Yeah, I'm no expert on this, but I have read a lot of people who theorize that the reason fantasy is so popular with young people is because they're facing a world where, first of all, they're never going to own a house because they can't afford to, and they're never going to be able to afford to, and they're facing global warming that we don't seem to be intending to fix, and they're facing war that nobody seems to figure out, how to end, and they're frustrated and they're scared, and fantasy's their escape. Now, I don't know this because I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist. I have no idea whether this is true or not, but it makes sense to me.
Mhm. Yeah, it makes sense to me too. And plus, post pandemic, I think everyone is still, for young people especially, I'm sure still reeling a little bit from it. Just the big change during that time period. So yeah, I
Well, and
wonder.
I think, yeah, and I think their whole school, um, the whole school schedule, and going to classes and making friends and learning how to be a social animal and all of that was so upset that it's going to take that generation a very long time to get beyond that
Hmm,
if they do.
yeah, really interesting. Yeah, it's we'll have to put a few heads together to see if we can figure out how to promote historical fiction or try to get more people interested in it and just trying to. I wonder if the hesitation there is because they're afraid it'll read like a textbook. It'll be
Oh
dry.
yeah.
Is that?
Oh yeah. Oh, I think that's very true, and I think that people think, "Oh, the barbarians." I've read about that. There's nothing new to learn there, and what we learned about the barbarians as history students in high school or junior high was, three sentences, and we move along. And I don't think there was ever enough discussion that made people interested
Hmm,
or curious about what was going on at that time. And history so often was taught as dates and names. And I had a very interesting history professor, I shouldn't say professor, a history teacher in high school, who we were doing world history. And instead of looking at history from, uh, year zero to 1948, went backwards.
hmm,
And so he said, okay, here's the world in 1965 or 1968. We're in Vietnam. How did this happen? And you'd go backwards
hmm,
and you'd say, how did it happen? And then you'd say, okay, well, it started here. How did that happen?
hmm,
And you go backwards. And I think if history had been taught that way, so people realize that it's not just names and dates, but there are reasons that these things happen, and there are trends, and there are, there's hunger, and there's war, and where do these things come from? It didn't just, wasn't preordained.
hmm.
There's a reason all of this stuff happened, and watching that history go backwards was a fascinating way to learn history. And I'll bet you there's not 1% of history taught that way.
No, I think a lot about that because when I was younger, I had really no interest in history. Like it always seemed like things to remember. It didn't seem like a
Right.
story was being told.
Memorize. Yeah.
But now, as I'm getting older, I find history more interesting. I think it's because I see more of a story now. It seems like it's something more engaging and more interesting to see how we, like you said, how we get from this point to that point, and why it's all connected in some way.
Yeah, and how we ended up here. I don't know how we raised the interest in historical fiction because, Hilary Mantel was very popular, but only within a very small niche, only with a very small population of people. Um, and the Rebel Nun sold very well. Candlemaker's Woman is just come out, and I'm not sure whether it will sell well or not. But I don't know really the real struggle as a marketing, as self published marketing person, which is the case with the Candlemaker's Woman, not with the Rebel Nun. That was traditionally published. The struggle is, how do you get people to think
Hmm.
that this time period is interesting? And well, one of the things you do is you create an interesting cover and you write interesting back cover copy. But trying to get people to even find that is really, really hard, especially without the ability to hire a $40,000 publicist.
Jeez. What about the Rebel Nun? Do you think helped it sell so well? What was it about that? Was it? the was there a specific thing that happened, or do you think it was the interest in the story? What is there anything that you reflecting now on the Rebel Nun? Is there something that you feel like helped it get to readers?
Well, certainly having a traditional publisher always helps because that gives you access to the reviews and book list and the New York Book Review and or the New York Review of Books and places that a self-published author can't
Hmm.
reach. So certainly that helped. My agent said that what really fascinated her about the story was that it was a true story and that it was so surprising. And the fact that this woman was true, what happened was true, really interested her. So I think the fact that it was a real person, with a real story that was recorded poorly by bishops, but was true, was part of its success. I think The Candlemaker's Woman is a better story. I think it's a more interesting story, and I think it says more about today's world than The Rebel Nun did. But I think it's going to be a harder sell because it's self-published.
Hmm. And what is the Candlemaker's Woman about?
It's about a woman, a girl, 16-year-old girl, or 15, I forget now. I think she's 16 or 15, who is among those tribes escaping the Huns. And in order for her tribe to get across the Rhine River, they have to go through Burgundy,
Hmm.
a territory held by the Burgundians. And the Burgundians require them to give up their children, and they sell those children across the Rhine River in Gaul
Hmm.
to people. So they become slaves. So this is about a girl who's sold into slavery in Gaul to a candlemaker, and she becomes the candlemaker. She basically becomes the candlemaker because the candlemaker himself's an old drunk, and he didn't do anything, right? Except abuse her, of course. And so it's a story about her learning this trade, falling in love, and then the invasion happens.
Hmm.
The barbarians come across the river in 406 AD. It's actually New Year's Eve, midnight. The Rhine River freezes for the first time in decades. And suddenly the Romans can't hold the Roman troops, the Roman legionnaires can't hold the tribes back because they can flood across. They flood across the river and they basically run across Gaul. And she's caught in the middle of this. Her family comes across, and she loses her lover in the mess, and she has to try to figure out how to pull her life back together. And so it's a story about a young slave girl who basically it's a coming of age story. She learns who she is and she figures out what talents she has and she survives. And not only does she survive, but she basically saves her family.
Hmm. Wow. Well, you
Yeah.
got me.
Yeah, it's a happy ending.
Yeah.
It's a happy ending, yes.
Yeah. I feel like we could go on for hours. I think we could go on forever. But I did have a couple of questions for you I'd like to ask my guests. Well, not all of them because you're from Iowa. I was curious what your thoughts on Ragbri. If I'm sure you're familiar with Ragbri, but I wanted to go this year. I don't know that I'll make it, but is it worth
Well,
going or is it?
I did Sagbri, which was second annual Great Bike Ride across
Oh,
Iowa
okay.
before they changed the name to Ragbri. So I did Sagbri, the whole thing, and I did Ragbri 3 and Ragbri 4. I can't tell you how many years ago that was because it would be embarrassing to me, but it was many, many years ago. And I loved it. I mean, it was really, I was a real, I used to race bicycles. So
Nice.
I was really into it and I really enjoyed it. And I'm glad I did it those 3 times. Did I do? Yeah, 3 times. Sagbri, Ragbri 3, and Ragbri 4. So I think it's great. And what you need to realize is that Iowa's not flat.
Yes, that's what I keep hearing. I have a friend for that
Yes.
group that was from Iowa, and he keeps telling me it's not flat. There's lots of hills and it's humid and it's really hot. So,
Yeah, it's humid, it's hot, and it's not flat. The good thing is they always go from west to east, which means you have the advantage of the westerlies when they cooperate, unless the storm tends to,
mm,
build up on the, farther east and come your way. You're basically given a little bit of help from the wind going west to east.
yeah, I hope to make it this year. For
Well, good for you.
those who don't know, Ragbri is a ride you bicycle across the state of Iowa, and every night you stop in a specific place, and it's basically like a big celebration, from what I hear, from what I gather. And every
Yeah,
night you stop.
it's a party across the
Hmm.
state. And when I went on Sagbury, I think there were maybe 150 of us. It was very small. The Ragbri 3 was a little bigger. Today, I guess it's
Yeah,
huge. And they now actually have a lottery. But back then, when I was doing it, you'd go into these towns, and these townspeople would show up, and they'd make sandwiches, and they would have concerts for you, and it was really a great party, and but a very low key party. I guess it's gotten quite a bit rowdier and quite a bit, of course, a lot more crowded. I mean, tens of thousands of people do it now. So it's an entirely different experience that I had. So I hate to mislead you and make you think that it's something that is really not anymore. But it's still a great experience.
yeah. It's on my bucket list. One of these days I'll make it. Yeah.
Good.
But I did want to ask you. I would like to ask all of my guests is if what the first question is: was there ever a hobby or thing that you thought you would enjoy, but when you tried it, you did not enjoy it?
I would have to say swimming.
Hmm.
I have never been able to swim, and I have many times in my life decided, well, I'm going to learn how to swim, and I'm going to enjoy it. And I hate swimming. My feet sink. I cannot stay on top of the water. So swimming is certainly something I've never ever taken to. Pickleball would be another one. I used to play tennis
Hmm.
when I was younger, before my knee gave out, and I loved tennis. And there's a lot of athletic things. I love to ski, and I still love hiking. I just had my knee replaced, so I'm kind of out of it right now. But I loved all of those things. But I tried pickleball, and I just thought, this is obnoxious. The noise, the sound itself drove me bananas. So I've never enjoyed it, even though I thought, well, this is a nice alternative to tennis, which I can't play right now because of my knee. But it's really, yeah, didn't like it. So I would say I'm always thinking about sports things, because those are the things, if you're sort of a writer, you know, literary kind of person, what's the other side of that? It's athletic things. And so I've always really tried to balance my life with athletic things, but there's some of them have been great and some of them can't do.
Hmm.
Cooking, I'm a great cook. So I don't know if it's really a hobby or just something you do to feed yourself. Um, but yeah, I like to cook. My husband's actually a good cook. So I don't know. Is that kind of what you were looking
Yeah,
for?
and actually, my second question is: do you have a favorite family recipe?
Not a family recipe. My mother was a horrible cook.
Okay.
She was a great baker. She baked wonderful things, and she could, I remember her cream puffs. Oh, just incredible. But when it came to cooking dinner, it was always what was necessary to do. And her spices ranged from salt to pepper. And in spite of the fact that she grew a wonderful garden and raised beautiful vegetables and was so successful as a gardener, she actually sold things at the supermarket well, it wasn't a supermarket, the grocery store downtown. It's too small a town to have a supermarket. But she was a great gardener, but cooking was not her thing. Her roasts were always overcooked. The goulash was not goulash. It was macaroni with hamburger and tomato sauce. She was a terrible cook. So not a favorite family recipe. I would say definitely not.
Okay.
No.
Do you have do you have a favorite recipe now that either you do or your husband makes?
Oh yeah, my husband does a great job of making artichoke carbonara, which is
Hmm.
basically carbonara sauce with artichokes in it, and it's truly excellent. It's really habit forming. Um, and I make lots of things. Stroganoff. I make a wonderful bolognese sauce. So, pretty traditional stuff. But I think that we're both really serious about it. We grow our own herbs, and we're pretty serious about cooking, and doing it right.
Hmm. Nice. And the last question I have for you is a tough one, but it's what was your first job, and what did you learn from that experience?
My first job at maybe 11 or 12 was babysitting during the summer for three kids. And I lasted exactly 2 days, and I learned that I don't like kids. I learned I never wanted kids, and I never had kids. Um, and I learned that babysitting was not my thing. So, yeah, that was my first job, and I hated it. And it probably, warped my life. So I decided I never wanted to have children. When I met my husband 35 years ago, he didn't want to have children. And so it was a match made in heaven. But no, I hated babysitting. I just despised it.
It's it's a very important decision to be learned, or a very important thing to learn so early on.
Yeah, at 11.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, it was. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Well, it's better that you learned early than found out
No
later. Yeah.
kidding. What a mistake that would have been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for. I know you're very busy, so thank you for taking time out of your day to come and chat with me.
Oh no, no, not never too busy for this. This has been so much fun. I almost feel like I've been spoiled for an hour and a half. This is, who gets to talk about themselves and their work this way? It's been terrific. Thank you
Oh,
so
yeah.
much.
Thank you. No, the door. You're welcome back anytime. I'd love to. I mean, I can think of another 10 or 20 things we could talk about. I mean, there's just so much.
Well, maybe we'll do that someday. That'd be
Yeah,
fun.
let me know when, and we'll make it happen.
Okay.
Cool. Well, thank you so much,
Well,
and
thanks, Steve. It's been nice to meet
you
you.
too. And thanks everyone for listening, and hope everyone has a great weekend.